Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. Taoist Heavenspan was in the nastiest of moods. Originally, he had assumed that the Blood Ancestor wouldn't be able to delay him for more than a short moment. However, the Blood Ancestor had been saving up life force for 10,000 years, and also had some secret methods imparted to him by the Gravekeeper. Combined with his madness and the fact that he had ignited himself for a final burst of power, he had been able to keep Taoist Heavenspan completely locked down. Bai Xiaochun, Taoist Heavenspan said through gritted teeth. He seemed supremely frustrated, and also no less furious than Bai Xiaochun. Over and over again, he had watched his ultimate desires crushed by the Gravekeeper at the last minute, turned into nothing more than pipe dreams. However, this time, things were playing out slightly differently. In addition to the anger in his eyes, there was something else shining brightly. Who would have thought that you would come here of your own volition? At least you've saved me the trouble of tracking you down myself. At last, I can refine you into an undying live forever pill. Licking his lips, he chuckled and waved his hands out in front of him, causing rumbling sounds to fill heaven and earth as the will of the world itself converged on his person. Then, he began to walk toward Bai Xiaochun. With every step he took, the will of the world grew stronger, until it became a mountain-toppling, sea-draining pressure that weighed down on Bai Xiaochun. Earlier, not even the Blood Ancestor, a descendant of the Arch-Emperors, had been able to stand up to this. In fact, it was because of the will of the world that the Blood Ancestor had burned his own blood to get the power he needed to drive his undying technique. That was what had enabled him to lock Taoist Heavenspan down for so long. But now, the will of the world didn't seem to affect Bai Xiaochun at all. He had mastered the undying live forever technique, and could now accept the title of Arch-Ancestor. He also conformed to the will of the world, and in fact, was also the ruler of this heaven and earth. Bai Xiaochun's eyes were bright red as he stared at the celestial walking toward him. His killing intent raged as he too took a step forward, whereupon the will of the world began to bless him. It was as if the entire world had been split in two because of Bai Xiaochun and the celestial. They strode toward each other until they were only 300 meters apart, both of them surging with different aspects of the power of the very world in which they lived. Boom! When they slammed into each other, it was like mountains and rivers colliding, creating a deafening boom that echoed out across the frozen Heavenspan Sea. Seemingly incapable of sustaining the force, the sea began to split apart. At the same time, Heavenspan Island, which had already been mostly destroyed by Baihao's flames, had reached the point where it couldn't stand any longer, and collapsed. It was a holy land that represented the ultimate authority and power in the Heavenspan realm, but now, it sank down into the Heavenspan Sea. As it did, a huge whirlpool formed, like a giant mouth of seawater. How amusing, the Celestial said. With that, he threw his head back and laughed uproariously. Despite having just fought bitterly with the Blood Ancestor, he was clearly just as powerful as before. Striding forward, he pointed up into the sky. 4 rivers form the heavenly bones. A golden sea to act as flesh. His voice seemed to contain the might of the heavens, a boundless power that would force reality to conform to his wishes. All of a sudden, what appeared to be the soul projections of the 4 rivers of the lands of Heavenspan shot toward the Celestial. At the same time, Heavenspan seawater began to rise up into the sky, taking shape around those souls, to shape the enormous hand that had caused despair to rise up in Baihao's heart, and kept the Blood Ancestor in check. Unfortunately for the Celestial, the Gravekeeper had died, and the world was withering away. Because of that, his Taoist magic had faltered during his battle with the Blood Ancestor, and had been destroyed. But now, the Gravekeeper was gone, along with his influence. As a result, there was now nothing to interfere with the Celestial's control of the will of the world, despite how it was split. Furthermore, he was far more familiar with that will than Bai Xiaochun. The Celestial waved his arm, and the gigantic hand began to fall down onto Bai Xiaochun from above. Bai Xiaochun looked up with a very somber expression. He could sense the pure power of the 4 rivers within that huge hand, as well as the aura of the Heavenspan Sea. Although it looked like nothing but a hand, in truth, it was like all of the lands of Heavenspan combined. He could not withstand such a blow. It didn't matter how powerful his fleshly body was, he would be felled by such power. At the same time, he knew that he couldn't compare to the ancient Celestial when it came to control over the power of this world. However, he did not shrink back. Eyes crimson, he looked up at the huge hand, threw his head back and shouted, "Who cares if I can't match up to you, Celestial?" The power of the Live Forever technique coursed through him, which he then channeled into a Taoist magic called the Water Swamp Kingdom. Water Swamp, he said, waving his arm through the air. He was confident that, with his powerful cultivation base, the mysterious divine beast would come forth with more power than ever before. Rumbling sounds immediately echoed out as the heaven-span sea transformed into a vast, watery swamp kingdom. Without any hesitation, he slapped his hands together, a sound which was accompanied by the roar of a beast from another world. Heaven and earth trembled from the sound of it, a sound that even the powerful celestial was shocked to hear. It was a howl of excitement and joy, as a moment came which that mysterious beast had been waiting a long time for. Thanks to Bai Xiaochun's current cultivation base, he could now open a true gap to allow the beast into the world. The entire heaven-span sea seemed to become a huge mouth that howled with deafening volume. This time, instead of mountain peaks rising up, an entire continent became visible. It was pitch black, not because it was covered with soil, but because it was covered with a forest of scale-like ridges. This continent was so large it was almost impossible to describe. Each scale that covered the continent was as large as Heavenspan Island had been. As the continent rose up into the air, it was possible to see that, on its bottom, were row upon row of what looked like inverted mountain peaks. If one looked closely, it was possible to see that this was actually not a continent. And the mountain peaks were not mountain peaks. They were actually razor-sharp teeth. This continent was the upper jaw of an enormous beast. Next came the lower jaw. When it was all visible, it looked like the mouth of a gigantic crocodile, rising up from within the heaven-span sea. Furthermore, its eyes were bright red, making them look exactly like Bai Xiaochun's eyes. The crocodilian head rose up and opened its mouth. Compared to it, Bai Xiaochun and the Celestial were like tiny bugs. Howling, the crocodilian head lunged toward the enormous hand of the world, and chomped it up. Bai Xiaochun was deeply shaken by what he was seeing. Looking at the enormous crocodilian head, he couldn't help but marvel at how everything was playing out. Never could he have imagined that his life essence spirit was so big, that it seemed capable of almost filling the entire world he lived in. On any other occasion, he might have been happy, but right now, there was no time for such thoughts. He looked up as the enormous hand of the world met his Water Swamp Kingdom beast, whereupon a heaven-rending, earth-crushing boom erupted out. The shockwave created a tempest that filled the entire heaven-span sea region as the hand of the world collapsed into pieces. As that happened, almost all of the mountains in the four river regions collapsed. However, Bai Xiaochun's life essence spirit also couldn't sustain the force. After chomping down on the hand of the world, it faded away. It was gone, not dead, of that Bai Xiaochun was certain. Up till now, his life essence spirit had only come as a projection. He would need a higher cultivation base to summon it in full. Eyes glittering, he considered summoning it again, but before he could, the Celestial threw his hands up, an unprecedentedly serious expression on his face. On the finger of one of his hands was a ring which he took off and threw down toward the heaven-span sea. "Seal," he shouted coolly. As the words left the Celestial's mouth, the falling ring erupted with seven-colored light, which spread out to illuminate all of the heaven-span sea, and the collapsing heaven and earth seemed to solidify. However, this was not because of any show of goodwill on the part of the Celestial. No, he just wanted to seal the world. Even he was shocked by the Taoist magic Bai Xiaochun had just unleashed, and therefore, he would ensure that no strange gates to other worlds could be opened, and no enormous beasts could appear. Apparently I underestimated the Taoist magics that can be unleashed here. Water Swamp Kingdom. The Celestial's eyes glittered with bright light as he spoke. Unfortunately for you, that magic won't work now. With the wave of his hand, the Celestial unleashed the sealing power of the ring, causing it to rush in Bai Xiaochun's direction. Bai Xiaochun had an equally serious expression on his face. He knew that the Celestial had been the lord of this world for many years, and had all sorts of reserve powers at his disposal. Not only could Bai Xiaochun not match up with him in terms of control of the power of the world, but he could also tell that the Celestial had so many techniques and items that it defied imagination. The ring he had just used emanated the most ancient of auras, something that left Bai Xiaochun with no doubts that it was a precious treasure. Although it likely couldn't match up to a world treasure, it surely had a very shocking origin. The sealing power which was currently descending onto him had a will of extermination in it, and yet, Bai Xiaochun didn't shrink back. Instead, he stepped forward, and used the undying hex to slip past it. Virtually all types of seals and restrictive spells were useless against Bai Xiaochun. Even as he passed through the sealing power, he utilized his mountain-shaking bash, which caused him to accelerate rapidly toward the Celestial. Then he unleashed the throat-crushing grasp. However, it was at this point that Bai Xiaochun's expression flickered. Without any hesitation, he suddenly danced backward. However, he was too slow. A cynical smile spread out on the Celestial's face. You really think someone like me would be scared of that life essence spirit of yours? And how could I not know that the undying hex of the Undying Codex can allow you to pierce through all types of sealing magic? You might be able to avoid the sealing mark, but you can't avoid the true power of my magical item. You've fallen right into my trap. Laughing uproariously, he waved his arms, causing the sealing power to suddenly fragment and shatter. As it did, it became a destructive force that rushed toward Bai Xiaochun from all sides. The use of the sealing power had just been a ruse. The Celestial's true goal had been to distract Bai Xiaochun, get him close, and then use the true power of his precious treasure. If one could view the scene from high above, they would see that Bai Xiaochun was now surrounded by mountain-toppling, sea-draining force that formed something like a huge ring around him, growing smaller and smaller with every passing moment. The destructive power skyrocketed with every moment that passed, causing Bai Xiaochun's face to fall from the sensation of deadly crisis that filled him. There was nothing he could do to fight back. The ring closed down in the blink of an eye, and the only thing he could do was reach out with his right hand, using it as a stand-in for his entire body. Intense pain stabbed through his right arm as the ring closed in around his flesh. As it did, the powers of regeneration within his flesh fought back against the ring. The Celestial frowned at how quickly Bai Xiaochun had reacted in this moment of crisis. Not only was he frustrated because of how difficult Bai Xiaochun was to deal with, he was left marveling at the shocking powers of the Undying Codex. So, I still need to pay a bit of a price to end things. The Celestial shook his head, then blurred into motion. Even as Bai Xiaochun's powers of regeneration worked against the binding of the ring, the Celestial unleashed another spectacular divine ability. Booms rang out as Bai Xiaochun fought back, and shockwaves spread out in all directions. However, Taoist Heavenspan's energy continued to rise. Despite only being a quasi-celestial, he had plenty of reserve powers that could push his battle prowess very close to the true Mahayana realm. Bai Xiaochun's cultivation base was lower than his, and he also had his right hand bound up. He shouldn't have been a match for Taoist Heavenspan, and yet, because of the heaven-defying powers of regeneration that came with the Undying Live Forever technique, he could recover from injuries far more quickly than even the Blood Ancestor. As a result, he was on equal footing with the Celestial in a fight. Blue veins bulged out on Bai Xiaochun's face and neck as his right hand clenched into a fist. By pouring all of the powers of regeneration he had at his disposal at the ring, as well as the full might of his fleshly body, he was finally able to overwhelm the precious treasure until it exploded. When that happened, Bai Xiaochun's battle prowess began to rise rapidly yet again. Clenching his hand into a fist, he struck out, causing a huge vortex to rumble toward the Celestial. The Celestial snorted coldly and backed up. Performing a right-handed incantation gesture, he waved his finger and spoke in a cold voice. Gluttonous flood snake. All of a sudden, from within the depths of the significantly depleted Heavenspan seawater, a roar erupted that shook heaven and earth, accompanied by a shocking aura. Water showered down in all directions as a 30,000-meter-long creature appeared. It was very much like a flood dragon, with the body of a snake, and a huge 3,000-meter-long head that was vaguely dragon-like in appearance. Overall, it looked fierce to the extreme. Instantly, powerful fluctuations rolled out in all directions. Fantastic crocodile. Things weren't over yet. The Celestial performed another incantation gesture, causing roars to echo out from all four of the Heavenspan rivers. Along with the roars came 4 golden crocodiles, which merged together to form a single 30,000-meter-long, 4-headed golden crocodile. Gloom bird. All of a sudden, a huge rock appeared in the sky, howling in such a way that it caused everything to tremble. Closer inspection revealed that the rock was covered with rotting flesh, beneath which were dry bones. This bird was actually a creature that had been dead for countless years. Sludge giant. Next, the lands in the southern part of the Heavenspan region exploded, and an enormous stone beetle crawled up from their depths. Everything around it immediately fossilized, causing massive white streaks to be left behind it as it crawled forth. I fought the Gravekeeper for many years, Bai Xiaochun. I have profound reserve powers the likes of which no one in the world could possibly contend with. As for you, what the hell makes you think you can come fight me? The Celestial waved his finger at Bai Xiaochun, sending all 4 of the beasts rushing in his direction. 3 of the animals were of little note to Bai Xiaochun. However, he had seen one of those golden crocodiles on numerous occasions. Of course, he could never have imagined that there were 4 of them, and that they belonged to the Celestial. Shockingly, all of these beasts pulsed with the power of the great circle of the demigod realm. Clearly, the fact that the blood ancestor had fought with the celestial for so long was suspicious, considering how powerful the former was. Granted, the blood ancestor was extraordinary, and had succeeded in buying time. However, the celestial couldn't possibly have been so out of sorts after fighting him. Obviously, the celestial had been waiting for the gravekeeper to succeed with his plan. The gravekeeper had been plotting against the celestial, but the celestial had also been plotting against the gravekeeper. He had been waiting for Bai Xiaochun to arrive, but more importantly, had been waiting for the gravekeeper to die. The person the celestial feared the most was the gravekeeper, a fear that had only grown deeper over the years in which the gravekeeper, despite growing weaker and weaker, had defeated him at every turn. Now that the gravekeeper was dead, the celestial could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Everything had been complicated before, but now, all he had to do was consume Bai Xiaochun to get his undying live forever pill. Such thoughts flashed through Bai Xiaochun's mind in the shortest of times. Considering how much of a schemer Taoist Heavenspan is, he thought, he must have something up his sleeve to make him completely and utterly confident in being able to win in the end. And there's no way that his true secret weapon is these 4 beasts. He immediately began to back up. In this life or death battle with the celestial, he had to maintain complete concentration. The celestial was the paragon entity in this world, and Bai Xiaochun knew that there was no room for slip-ups. If he made a mistake now, he would be dead forever. Unfortunately, only the gravekeeper had the ability to outthink the celestial. Bai Xiaochun had only spent a few short years on the path of cultivation, making it impossible for him to compare to the celestial in terms of plotting and scheming. Although he had somewhat of an idea of what the celestial was thinking, there were too many clues that he couldn't pick up on. Furthermore, there was no time to sit around thinking about the matter. The fight between the two of them was one in which life and death hung in the balance at every moment. Bai Xiaochun couldn't afford to be distracted, and therefore fully concentrated on the 4 beasts that were currently charging toward him. The gluttonous flood snake and the fantastic crocodile were both fantastically large, and were currently coming at him from the left and the right, clearly intent on ripping him to shreds. At the same time, the sludge giant and the gloom bird were coming at him from the front and behind, their piercing cries shattering the air around them. All of them radiated the fluctuations of the great circle of the demigod realm, giving birth to windstorms that could change the face of heaven and earth. From the look of things, they were not going to give Bai Xiaochun even the shadow of a chance to escape. In that moment of crisis, Bai Xiaochun unhesitatingly slapped his bag of holding and said, "Moonflower." The instant the words came out of his mouth, an aura erupted out that, even on its own, surpassed the auras of the 4 incoming beasts. Rumbling sounds could be heard as 9 bright green vines shot out at high speed. Following the vines was an enormous moonflower made of an infinitude of flower petals. An aura from beyond the heavens shook the entire area as the huge flower towered overhead. If the gravekeeper were alive, and the world were not withering to death, the world would instinctively attempt to crush this flower. But now, the will of the world was fragmented, and the moonflower erupted with shocking, otherworldly power. In fact, it seemed to pulse with something like a heaven Dao aura. Rumble. It was fully 30,000 meters tall, and radiated an aura of complete savagery. In addition, it glittered with brilliant designs. In that moment, a shocking roar erupted from the moonflower. Roar. Everything in the area began to shake, and the tempest that the 4 beasts had created was ripped to shreds. The moonflower didn't even need any direction from Bai Xiaochun. Even as the roar echoed out, the flower broke up into countless petals that streamed out in order to wipe all traces of the beasts out of existence. In the blink of an eye, the moonflower and the 4 beasts began to fight with utter ferocity. Taoist Heavenspan's eyes glittered in surprise because of Bai Xiaochun's moonflower. However, he merely glanced at it for a moment before heading directly toward Bai Xiaochun. Bai Xiaochun also began to head toward Taoist Heavenspan, and the two of them began to fight. Surrounded by the battling moonflower and 4 beasts, they performed incantation gestures and unleashed shocking divine abilities and Taoist magics. It only took a short time for all parties involved in the fighting to have exchanged thousands of blows. Although the moonflower was powerful, it was fighting against 4 opponents, and was gradually losing ground. Eventually, a howl erupted from inside of the flower, and it exploded, creating something like a sea of dandelion petals that surged toward the 4 beasts. The 4 beasts' expressions flickered as they lurched away. Unfortunately for them, they were too slow. In the blink of an eye, they were overwhelmed. The flying seeds slammed into them, boring into their bodies and seemingly drawing them up as food. When the 4 beasts began to scream miserably, Taoist Heavenspan noticed, and frowned. The sight of his four beasts rapidly withering away caused his heart to pound in his chest. What an incredible seed from beyond the heavens! Snorting coldly, his eyes flashed with determination as he performed an incantation gesture with his right hand. Voice as cold as ice, he said, "World relics, to me." As the words left his mouth, the four beasts suddenly shuddered and exploded into bits. From inside of the four beasts emerged millions upon millions of streams of sword energy, which screamed through the air like a tempest and then slashed into Bai Xiaochun. Wounds opened up everywhere, and although his powers of regeneration went to work immediately to heal him, his eyes still widened. Then, the sword energy shot back, and became 6 beams of light that swirled around Taoist Heavenspan. Shockingly, 6 colorful swords could be seen, all of them unique in design and appearance. They seemed incomparably sharp, and Bai Xiaochun could tell from just looking at them that they were ancient and powerful to the extreme. Were those 4 beasts embodiments of the Celestial's magical items? Wait, no, maybe the Celestial hid the 6 ancient swords inside of them. Even as he shot backward, the countless flying seeds swirled back, converging into the shape of a damaged and bedraggled moonflower. Its aura was weak, and it looked to be in bad shape thanks to the injuries inflicted by the explosion of sword energy. Interesting, Taoist Heavenspan said, hovering in midair, looking at Bai Xiaochun with coldly shining eyes. No wonder the Gravekeeper chose you. In all the years, no one other than him has ever forced me to use my life essence Daos words. The Undying Live Forever technique has its 5 shackles and 5 sealing marks. Spectacular, to say the least. However, the very reason why I can change my own fate in heaven-defying fashion is the 9 Tao gates that I created. I have cultivated these Tao gates for my entire life, and they require the use of these 6 Daos words to employ. In fact, it was by using the Daos words to open the Tao gates that I was able to kill the Arch-Emperor and slaughter countless numbers of his people. Today, I will similarly use my life essence Daos words to open the Tao gates and end your life. Even as he spoke, his energy began to rise higher and higher. Rumbling sounds filled all creation, and wild colors flashed in the sky. Massive waves covered the surface of the Heavenspan Sea. It was as if he had become the origin of all energy and power in the world, as if his every action or move could cause the Heavenspan realm to respond. Bai Xiaochun panted, a sensation of danger filling him the likes of which he had never experienced before. And the source was none other than the Celestial. Based on what he could sense, not even his powers of regeneration would allow him to recover from the next attack. And yet, he did not show any signs of backing down. The Celestial had a trump card, but so did Bai Xiaochun. The Celestial's energy caused the entire world to shake around him. Strange light erupted from his eyes as he threw his arms wide and spoke in a voice that filled the world. Tao Gate, Palace of Water. His words seemed to thrum with the power of a great Tao. As they did, his 6 swords flew forth, linking together to form a design with 3 rows. The top row featured 2 swords in a line, with a gap between them. The second row featured 2 swords together, with no gap. The third row looked exactly like the first row. Even as the design was completed, seemingly infinite streams of water vapor began to rise up from the withered lands of Heavenspan. It was as if all the water in the world were forming together into an ocean. That much water carried indescribable weight, and all of it began to fall onto Bai Xiaochun. Bai Xiaochun backed up in the face of the seemingly endless amount of water filling the sky. It was water that thrummed with destructive power, power that seemed capable of eradicating any life force that got in its way. Celestial magic? 9 Tao gates. Am I supposed to be impressed? Eyes bloodshot, he threw his head back and roared, clenching his right hand into a fist that caused a black hole to explode into existence. At the same time, a shadowy emperor appeared behind him, bursting with a domineering air. Undying. Emperor's Fist. The Tao Gate Palace of Water was part of the 9 ruins. The water of the 9 ruins made the Palace of Water boundless. The endless amounts of water around Bai Xiaochun thrummed with explosive, destructive power, and seemed indefatigable. It was seemingly capable of crushing anything and everything, and absorbing it to become part of the water. Water was innately a yin and feminine element, but Bai Xiaochun still unleashed the Undying Emperor's Fist. It was an attack backed with unyielding, dominating might, and was a convergence of both his fleshly body and cultivation-based power. No longer was this a quintuple power fist strike, but at the moment, Bai Xiaochun didn't have time to calculate exactly how powerful it was. His only thought was that he needed to break this seemingly endless flow of water around him. Even as his fist struck out, the fist of the shadowy emperor also struck out. Colors flashed and winds screamed. The world shook as a tremor ran through the water, which turned into vibrations that increased in intensity with every moment. Bai Xiaochun's eyes were completely bloodshot as he then shouted, stronger this time. Howling madly, he unleashed another undying Emperor's fist, which was even more shockingly powerful than before. Boom! An indescribably powerful tempest erupted out into the ocean of water created by the yin powers of the Palace of Water. Within moments, a limit was reached, and a series of explosions occurred. The enormous sea immediately began to break up. As it did, heavy rain began to fall in all parts of the world. The Wildlands was no exception, nor Archemperor City. Countless individuals looked up to see rain falling down toward them as the world shook beneath their feet. Back at the Heavenspan Sea, Taoist Heavenspan's eyes narrowed. Over and over again, Bai Xiaochun's might caused his unease to build. Snorting coldly, he didn't hesitate to say, Tao Gate, Palace of Mountains. At that point, his 6 swords once again began to move toward each other. However, before Taoist Heavenspan could finish creating the Palace of Mountains, Bai Xiaochun turned into something like a meteor that shot forward in attack. In response, Taoist Heavenspan snorted and performed an incantation gesture with his right hand, causing the 6 swords to rapidly lock together in the form of a design different from the last. Shockingly, it caused a mountain to materialize out of nowhere, which then slammed into Bai Xiaochun. It was thousands upon thousands of meters tall, and thrummed with shocking energy. The moment of impact caused a deafening boom to ring out, and also caused Bai Xiaochun's expression to flicker. Howling, he unleashed another fist strike, only to find that more and more mountains were falling down toward him. Each one was larger than the last. In the blink of an eye, more than 100 mountains filled the sky, with the last one being tens upon tens of thousands of meters high. And all of them were smashing down toward Bai Xiaochun, clearly giving him no room to evade. Even more shocking was that the Heavenspan Sea began to rumble as a mountain rose up from beneath its surface. More mountains appeared on either side of him as well. As of this moment, countless mountains became like magical items under the control of Taoist Heavenspan, to attack Bai Xiaochun. Bai Xiaochun could destroy one mountain. But as soon as he did, 10 more appeared, and then 100, and then more. Each mountain was larger and more powerful than the one before it. Bai Xiaochun's eyes continued to flicker with shock. Taoist Heavenspan's Tao Gates were virtually beyond compare. It was something the likes of which Bai Xiaochun had only seen during the spectacular battle in the Wildlands, when the Gravekeeper had used his 5 elements Taoist magic. Bai Xiaochun's expression was unprecedentedly serious as his undying blood began to burn. Blood qi immediately began to swirl out from his skin, and a maddened, bloodthirsty look sprang up in his eyes. And yet, he didn't even come close to losing consciousness. He now had complete and full control of the Godkiller technique. As he unleashed the Godkiller, blood qi towered to the heavens. Bai Xiaochun howled at the top of his lungs as he sent the burning blood mist out to meet the mountains. Every mountain that touched the mist shattered, its energy completely drained away as it transformed into ash. The blood mist began to grow stronger, casting the whole world into red light. Even as the mountains shattered, the Celestial frowned. Snorting coldly, he waved his sleeve and said, Tao Gate, Palace of Lightning. The booming of heavenly thunder exploded out, along with numerous black lightning bolts. In the blink of an eye, they filled the sky, and then began to fall onto Bai Xiaochun. There was so much lightning that it seemed to have no end, like the most ultimate of heavenly tribulations. As this Tao Gate opened, Taoist Heavenspan seemed to become the monarch of all lightning and thunder. This was a celestial magic that Taoist Heavenspan had personally created, and was one of the reasons why the Gravekeeper had described him in such dramatic terms to Bai Xiaochun in the past. This celestial magic that bordered on a great Tao was also one of the reasons that Taoist Heavenspan had been able to overthrow the Archemperor dynasty. It was the reason he was so confident that, if he left this world and went to the world beyond, he would be able to become a true celestial. He would definitely make his breakthrough. Furthermore, he would eventually be able to reach the peak level of power, the likes of which were as rare as phoenix feathers or Qilin horns even in the world beyond. He would become an Archean. With my talent, I am destined to become an Archean. Why do I have to be stuck in this cramped bug's nest of a world? Why do I have to struggle on death's door, just waiting for my longevity to run out? I refuse to accept this. A vicious, insane expression covered the Celestial's face as he strode forward, surrounded by crashing thunder and lightning. 100,000 bolts. 1 million bolts. 10 million bolts of lightning. Bai Xiaochun had his Godkiller technique, and had previously consumed lightning to advance his cultivation. But this was lightning created by the Celestial's Taoist magic, and was something he could not simply shrug off. As the boundless sheets of heavenly lightning dropped toward him, Bai Xiaochun looked up at them, his eyes shining with no less madness than Taoist heavenspans. "Nice magical technique," he growled. "But I have something just like it." Eyes burning with killing intent, he threw both hands out in front of him. Drawing all of the blood chi back into him, he unleashed the power of the Live Forever Codex. The Undying Codex had its 5 divine abilities. But the Live Forever Codex had 5 Taoist magics. As of this moment, he was using the first of the magics that he himself had created as part of the Live Forever Codex. They were world-shaking Taoist magics of his own creation. One glance abyss crystallization. As Bai Xiaochun's voice rolled out, it sounded like an expression of the Tao, as though a great bell had been struck that resonated through all heaven and earth. This was the heavenly reverberation of a true Taoist magic. In the briefest of moments, the entire heavenspan sea emitted loud cracking sounds as it transformed into crystal. All the waves and ripples in it became solid and crystallized. Inside and out, the heavenspan sea was now as transparent as glass. The heavenspan sea now looked like a land of ice, glowing with radiant and shocking light. That blinding light shot up to meet the lightning above, whereupon more cracking sounds rang out. Suddenly, it was in completely shocking fashion that the entire crystalline sea shattered into millions upon billions upon trillions of crystalline swords. Shining with boundless light and multitudinous razor-sharp manifestations of sword energy, the crystalline swords all turned upward and shot toward Taoist heavenspan. At this point, Taoist heavenspan's face fell. Countless crystalline swords began to rise up into the air from the crystallized abyss that was the heavenspan sea, creating a screaming whistle that filled the world. The swords cast dazzling light in all directions, to such blinding effect that Taoist heavenspan's face fell from the shock of it all. Although he was very familiar with how the divine abilities of the Live Forever Codex worked, this was his first time seeing one of Bai Xiaochun's personalized Taoist magics. Furthermore, Taoist heavenspan was very well aware that the power of the Taoist magics of the Live Forever Codex surpassed any other ordinary techniques by far. In addition, the specific way that such divine abilities were created had to do with the Tao and will of the individual cultivator. Each cultivator had a different Tao and a different will, and thus, the Taoist magics they could create would all be different. Therefore, it didn't matter how deeply Taoist heavenspan had researched the Live Forever Codex, there was no way he could be familiar with Bai Xiaochun's Taoist magics before they were revealed. What will Bai Xiaochun's Taoist magics accomplish in the end? Taoist heavenspan didn't dare to look down on Bai Xiaochun in this moment. Looking around at the endless cloud of crystalline swords, he prepared to flee. However, the swords were too fast, and before he could do anything, they were upon him. Looking slightly nervous, he performed a double-handed incantation gesture, causing the lightning from the Palace of Lightning to shrink down. Instead of using that lightning to attack Bai Xiaochun, he threw it up as a shield against the crystalline swords. Rumbling sounds filled all heaven and earth as the millions upon billions upon trillions of crystalline swords smashed into the lightning shield. The Tao Gate, Palace of Lightning, was immediately weakened and began to shrink down, and yet, managed to stand against the assault of swords. The crystalline swords slammed against the shield and then toppled down, falling one on top of the other to create a huge pile underneath Taoist heavenspan. The pile of swords grew higher and higher until finally, the lightning shield shattered. By the time it was all over, the masses of swords had created something like a small mountain beneath Taoist heavenspan's feet. So, that's your Taoist magic, Bai Xiaochun? Although Taoist heavenspan was panting a bit as he stood there on the mountainous pile of swords, his eyes shone with piercing light. Bai Xiaochun looked back at him coldly, then extended his right hand, pointed out with his finger, and said, "Heavenly Canopy Lampshade." As soon as the words left Bai Xiaochun's mouth, the sky began to tremble and grow murky. Then, the sky seemed to break up into numerous layers, almost like cloth. In the blink of an eye, the lowermost of the layers began to drop down and cover Taoist heavenspan. The heavenly canopy was difficult to see clearly at first, and was identifiable mostly by how it twisted and distorted the air around it. In response, the celestial's expression flickered, and he quickly performed an incantation gesture to unleash the Tao Gate, Palace of Wind. As he did, a black wind sprang out of nowhere to block the descending heavenly canopy. However, even as the celestial's Taoist magic was unleashed, a second heavenly canopy began to fall, and then a third. Soon, the sky itself was starting to seem thin. Before long, the eighth canopy had dropped down toward the heavenspan sea, and seemed just on the verge of sealing Taoist heavenspan. Taoist heavenspan now stood on a pile of crystal, surrounded by a black wind, struggling to escape. Meanwhile, the 8 heavenly canopies dropped down, spreading over him just like a lampshade. Despite being a manifestation of the fallen sky, the lampshade wasn't blue, but rather light gray. By this point, enough of the sky had peeled away from above that it was possible to see the black void beyond. Taoist Heavenspan panted heavily, his heart filled with unease and a sensation of crisis. Bellowing, he sent the black wind to batter this way and that, and yet, it did no good. Even as Taoist Heavenspan's shock intensified, Bai Xiaochun's eyes turned even icier. Performing an incantation gesture with his left hand, he waved his finger and spoke in a voice that echoed like thunder. Boundless longevity, endless life. As the 4 words left his mouth, the aura of the Live Forever Codex erupted out into the world, filling the air with innumerable longevity characters. 1. Although the characters were very small, they all pulsed with the aura of the Live Forever Codex. Furthermore, there were literally too many to count. In fact, there were far more than the crystalline swords from before. A moment later, rumbling sounds could be heard as the longevity characters shot toward the heavenly canopy lampshade that covered Taoist Heavenspan, and merged into it. As they fused with the lampshade, the characters emanated a shocking aura which strengthened the lampshade and made its sealing powers vastly more incredible than before. Inside, Taoist Heavenspan was starting to get very nervous. All of a sudden, he had the premonition that if he didn't get out of this heavenly canopy lampshade, he would be in profound danger. I have to get out of here. Now. He tried to move, but no matter what he did, he was incapable of freeing himself. Overwhelmed by a sensation of danger, he howled and performed an incantation gesture to unleash the Tao Gate, Palace of Fire. Instantly, Taoist Heavenspan was surrounded by majestic heavenly fire that sent indescribable heat out in all directions, setting the heavenly canopy ablaze. It was in that moment that the killing intent in Bai Xiaochun's eyes blazed. Ignoring the blazing heavenly canopies, he reached out to point at the sealed celestial. Thou art the candle. His voice crashed like deafening thunder, and slammed directly into Taoist Heavenspan's body. Taoist Heavenspan let out a miserable shriek. His eyes were crimson, and his hair in complete disarray as, without any warning whatsoever, a layer of wax appeared all over him. It was sinister and white, and in the blink of an eye, it covered him completely. With every moment that passed, it grew thicker and thicker, as did the celestial's unease. Unleashing the power of his cultivation base to try to protect himself, he shouted, Tao Gate, Palace of Marshes. The Palace of Marshes didn't summon water, but rather, a swamp. As Taoist Heavenspan opened his mouth to utter the words, white wax spilled into it. However, the area surrounding him still turned into a marshy swamp, filled with decay and rot. It was the type of thing that could melt anything within its bounds, and apparently, he hoped that it would neutralize the wax and cause the seal of the heavenly canopy to melt away. Rumbling sounds filled heaven and earth as the power of the rotting swamp combined with the effects of the previous Tao Gates, causing the heavenly canopies to begin to break apart. However, with the bolstering of the longevity characters, the lampshade held. No matter what techniques Taoist Heavenspan used, no matter how strong his Tao Gates were, as of this moment, he simply couldn't fight Bai Xiaochun's live forever Taoist magic. Despite being counteracted to a degree by the rotting swamp, the wax continued to build up around Taoist Heavenspan. Soon, he was completely white, and looked like he was made of wax. Damn it, he shouted, his expression twisting ferociously. Drawing on what appeared to be an even more powerful magic than before, he blasted away at the white wax, which began to crumble and crack. At the same time, the heavenly canopy lampshade also seemed to be on the verge of shattering. However, that was when Bai Xiaochun took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, fire blazed to the heavens. Live forever lamp, integrate. The celestial's body was the waxy candle, and Bai Xiaochun's eyes were the spark. This was none other than the personalized divine ability that Bai Xiaochun had created after mastering the Live Forever Codex. It was the Live Forever lamp. Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.